So if the Americans are going to go out and do something, I think lots of carrots and lots of trying to convince the Russians that really in the long run we want to invest in you, we want to build hotels, so to speak. And then you can stop acting crazy, as he said the other day, about Putin. It won't work, but that's what the Americans will try to do.
Rasmus Nilsson, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Just start us off, before we talk about the pressure Trump could put on Vladimir Putin, why would Putin want to kick the negotiations into the long grass, drag his feet as Ukraine's allies are accusing him of? And why is prolonging the war something he'd be interested in when it seems like the war has not gone as planned by any stretch of the imagination?
No, I mean, if we take a last point you said here, Vladimir Putin expected back in 2022 that Russia could effectively take over the control centers in Ukraine within a few days, maybe a few weeks at most. That obviously didn't happen. However, Putin clearly wants to, or has some interest in prolonging the war now, because the Russian state has now been set up in terms of its identity, in terms of its function, been set up to be on a war footing for the longer term. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means that domestically, of course, as long as Russia is on a war footing, or Putin can say that Russia is on a war footing, then he can use different mechanisms at home, more repressive methods, in order to keep any sort of domestic challenges away from the public, but also, and I think more importantly, from the elite. I mean, we saw previously with Prigozhin that there have been attempts at, let's say, damaging Putin's control domestically, and obviously he wants to preempt that. So if he can show the elites in Russia and the public that we all have to stay together in light of this outside threat, not necessarily the threat from Ukraine, but the threat from, the Western-led world more broadly, then that would work for him. Economically as well, of course, there are lots of people now earning good money, significant parts of the elite in Russia earning good money on the war because of investments in and ownership of parts of the military-industrial complex. They're, of course, interested in keeping this going for the longer term, not to benefit Russia, but to benefit themselves. You have, over the last few years, seen a continuous slight shift in some of the members of the elite, and the elite sitting there now, they do need the war to continue, or at least that would benefit them significantly. So these would be reasons why Vladimir Putin would want to push on. Also, of course, if Putin is presented with a, let's call it, solution to the war, that puts him in light as a weak person, as a loser in the war, then obviously that can not only remove the advantages he's got of running the war as it currently stands, but it can also make him vulnerable, extra vulnerable to future threats. So these would be some of Putin's reasons for keep the war going as things stand, unless he can, of course, be offered something that would, some sort of so-called peace solution that would put him in a stronger position.
Obviously, Donald Trump has spoken a lot about one of his aims being to end the war in Ukraine and be the great peacemaker. Let's talk through some of the ways he could try to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to agree to a peace, which Putin otherwise seems reticent to agree to for the reasons you've said. Let's start with just first the diplomatic levers that Trump can pull. What are they?
Yes, starting with diplomatic, I would agree with you. That's probably the right place to start. The one thing I will preface my answer here with is just to say that I think you can argue, and I would argue, that the American administration, America as it is now, and Russia are de facto allies in this. And that's what we got to remember. They are not, it's not that Trump's America is a neutral arbiter or is on the side of Ukraine. It is in a number of practical ways an ally of Russia, and I'll explain what that means. If we go for the diplomatic angle first, if you like. Well, what Trump could do to get Putin convinced would be to say, and show Putin that Russia can be placed at the same level, in a sense, of America. That effectively, if Trump can show Russia, and he's tried to do that on several occasions, that really we in America, we're interested primarily about what happens in America and on the American continent. Yes, we also have interest in Europe, and obviously we want that to be respected, but you, Russia, if you want to sort of dominate your near abroad, your Ukraine, maybe even your Central Europe, maybe controlling the domestic politics of these countries, but certainly having a definitive say over the foreign policy of these countries, then that's okay for America. Now, if Trump were to say that openly, and as I argued before, he has hinted that, more than hinted that on several occasions, that would be a big fillip for Putin, partly because there is this long-standing fear and long-standing narrative in the Russian elite that the West is out to topple Russia, through foreign-sponsored coups and all that. By the way, that's a rhetoric, going back to my point before, that's a rhetoric you find in part of the American elite as well, about Europeans coming in and trying to subvert American democracy, so-called. So if Putin could tell to, if Trump could tell to Putin that we want to give Russia some space, you can sort of dominate Ukraine if you like, we can roll back some of the policy initiatives, we can show you that we have no interest in supporting any sort of political elite, and we can show you that we think that Russia is a real country, but Ukraine is not. If Trump comes out and says these things, gives Russia a place at the high table, if you like, almost like in the old days when you had the superpower so-called sitting around, that would go a long way to show up, well, Putin's prestige domestically certainly, but also Russia's prestige as Putin sees it. Now, by all accounts, as I've indicated already, in this, Russia and America are allies. This is the sort of world Trump wants as well, with a few so-called strong leaders, like Trump, like Putin, maybe even like Xi Jinping, if they can get over that little trade spat, who can then control different parts of the world. And in that sort of world, of course, there isn't much space for the Europeans.
It sounds like it's sort of more carrots than sticks diplomatically.
Oh God, yes.
With Trump, his economic policy is a huge part of his foreign policy and his diplomatic policy. So let's turn there next. What sort of economic pressure, or I suppose economic incentives, are on the table for Trump to get Putin to do what he wants?
So if we go for a moment with the sticks, or potential sticks, just before I'm going to come to the carrots in a moment. Well, he could, of course, Trump could put in more sanctions. He could put in secondary sanctions against anybody, countries working with the Russians. So here we're talking about countries like India, maybe Brazil, China, so on and so forth. Now, in order to do that effectively, and just for this brief moment, I will assume that Trump would want to do this, then he would need allies. He would need the world to go with him in this. Trump has shown himself exceptionally unable to build up economic allies around the world. I mean, the whole tariff debacle that we've had since April sort of has placed America in a corner. Now, that obviously isn't always a problem for America, it's a big economy and so on. But if you want to run the economic world order, if you want to direct it, as sometimes America has been able to in the past, then it doesn't really help to annoy everybody around you. I mean, for instance, how exactly would the Americans convince the Chinese that this is the way China should go? They're not going to be able to do that. Can they force the Chinese to do so? Well, if they could force them, I would argue since April we should have seen signs that the Chinese were buckling, and they are not. So I would say, Trump has not shown the competence to do this, even though, yes, America could theoretically bring in secondary sanctions and that would have an effect. They could also theoretically try to work on keeping oil prices down to damage the Russian budget. But again, that requires strategic thinking. It requires allies that work along the same lines of thinking, and Trump is not building that up. Now, in terms of carrots, here, of course, what the Americans can do is that they can try and talk about investment in Russia and Russian investment in America. And obviously the Americans can themselves take off sanctions on Russia, sanctions that they have placed. I will admit that I have feared for a while that the Americans could start doing that. I still think that's perfectly possible. It obviously won't solve all Russia's problems, partly because the Europeans will probably keep their sanctions going, and partly because the Russian economy is not going very well, and it hasn't been going well for more than a decade, really, if you're looking at sustainability. But it would certainly help the Russians, and again, if we assume, which I think we can, that individual members of the Russian elite, including Mr. Putin, are not that interested in the economic fate of Russia, but are very interested in the economic fate of themselves, then they could obviously get quite a lot of money in from working with American investors. So that's what I think he can do. And would that mean that the war will end? Well, I can see him convincing the Russians to some sort of ceasefire, practical ceasefire, at least for the time being in Ukraine, where you have more or less borders that are frozen more or less where they are now. And if, for instance, you're looking at what the Ukrainians were doing yesterday with the drone attacks on airplanes and so on, blowing up bridges and what have you, that is clearly the Ukrainians saying to Russia, but also to America, look, we're not stopping just because the two of you are chatting. We've still got war aims here. And trying to convince Trump that he can't simply do a quick deal. That was obviously what Trump and his administration were trying to do recently. And it didn't work, not least because the Ukrainians kept going, and to some extent the rest of Europe kept going.
Okay, and then finally, militarily, what sort of pressure could the US put on Russia militarily? That seems sort of the last resort, but that's always an element of diplomatic negotiation.
Well, of course it is. You're absolutely right. Well, yeah, I mean, we need to distinguish between different things. Obviously, something like, threatening to invade Russia or whatever, not only would Trump never do it, but it's also a non-starter. Even if, just for the sake of argument, we take away the nuclear weapons issue, Russia has a size and has a military capability, non-nuclear even, that is easily strong enough to resist anything like that. I mean, that's not going to happen. You can, of course, talk about handing over more weapons to the Ukrainians. I would say there, though, that, well, two things. First of all, any sort of military pressure placed on Russia by during the war now will have to come from the Ukrainian side. It will have to involve Ukrainian expertise, Ukrainian initiative, as we saw indeed yesterday. So that's dependent first and foremost on the Ukrainians more than anybody else. Now, when it comes to equipment, and here I think we should particularly be looking at logistical equipment, particularly looking at, if you like, the day-to-day arms. So there's a lot of talk about HIMARS and what have you, and that's great. But also look at things like guns, bullets, and what have you. Here I'm looking much more to the Europeans. I'm looking to the Germans, for instance. I am, to some extent, I'm still cautiously optimistic about the British side of this. I'm looking to the French. Yeah? Because at the end of the day, considering that a full-scale invasion is just not going to happen, and that's not ever on the cards, we're looking at the long term here, and I think that's sort of an overarching message I'd like to get across. Let's say Putin dies tomorrow. He's an elderly man, can happen. Okay, could happen in various ways, obviously. But Russia is not going to change overnight even without him. We're looking at this for the next 5 to 10 years, even if hypothetically, an armistice comes soon, which it could do, or some sort of ceasefire one way or the other, maybe some sort of halfway Korean solution, if you see what I mean. This has been mentioned. But even if that were to happen, you will keep having the tensions. You will keep having a militarized Russia. You will keep having, if I'm going to be extremely charitable to whoever comes after Trump in America, you will have a disinterested America. It's more likely, as I say, to have an America that would actually rather like Russia to have a dominant say in Europe, but that's by the by. Again, Trump is an old man, he will disappear soon, but America doesn't change after him. There was a lot of support for his attitude in America. So we need to stick this out in the long run, and the Ukrainians need to know that we can stick with them in the long run. So who are we in this case? Well, at the end of the day, it is the Europeans. It is the French, it is the Germans, it is the British, it is the Italians, it's the Scandinavians, it's that group, it's the Dutch and so on, it's Central Europe as well. And we have to continuously feed and say, we're not giving up. Okay, we can't necessarily help you storm all the Russian positions now, but we can shore you up and we can keep you going. And then we can help Ukraine, which is the essential bit. We can help Ukraine to become a well-functioning, well-governed country, which it hasn't always been in the past. I mean, Zelensky himself would agree to this, I'm sure. That we can help through investment, through best policy practices being shared, so on and so forth. Through, for instance, also putting Western, for instance, Germany, as we saw the other week, production in Ukraine, and Britain has talked about that as well. None of this would come from America, not even if it was a disinterested America. There you will get the profit maximization, which I'm not necessarily saying is evil, I'm just saying it's not particularly helpful here. So this is what we need in the long run. And I'm afraid those are much more, back to what I said before, Tom, you started with the diplomatic angle. I think that's absolutely right. Look at diplomacy, look at the signals that are sending, then look at economy. The military is important, but it's sort of a third order thing. We have to look at this in the long run. And
are there any parts of Trump's diplomatic, economic, military, any sort of other arsenal which we've not touched on? What are the any other ways, levers that Trump can pull? to influence Putin?
Well, I mean, one could be very naughty and say that if the American administration spent as much time concentrating on Russian domestic politics as they have tried to concentrate on, say, Polish, Romanian, German, Moldovan domestic politics, British domestic politics, then the Russians might feel slightly more threatened. But that doesn't seem to be happening. I will also say, of course, I mean, you and I both know, your listeners will know, that over the last 20, 30 years, we have seen many examples of the West, broadly speaking, trying to get involved in domestic politics outside this area, and it hasn't always gone particularly well. So what I'm trying to say is that the other thing the Americans could theoretically do would be to try and sort of subvert the Russian regime from inside. But A, I'm not sure how successful that would be. If anything, you'd probably get a rallying around the flag among Russians. And B, as I said before, the Americans have no interest because, of course, back to my earlier point, the Americans, you can see it, say, with J.D. Vance's comment to Zelensky when Zelensky visited in that infamous meeting about how Zelensky had visited factories on behalf of Biden during the election or early part of the election campaign. There was this, and on behalf of the Democrats more broadly, there was this underlying accusation from Vance that the Ukrainians were there to subvert American democracy. So you're not really going to see the Americans trying to do this in what they hope would be an ally. I think if this is going to go as the Americans would like it to go, this will end with some level of ceasefire, or at least, more or less formal. That's not really the essential part for them. And then it will end with America gradually, or maybe quickly, opening up for economic investments in Russia again, and then somehow economic trade solves everything. I can think of a number of esteemed friends I've got who might agree to that. I don't. I think the problem would only persist and get worse. But the thing about the myth about strong men and a few strong women is that if only you've got one person in charge, they can handle everything. I can't really think of a historical case where that actually worked. But for people like Donald Trump, and I'm afraid a number of people sympathizing with him, that would seem to be the solution. So if the Americans are going to go out and do something, I think lots of carrots and lots of trying to convince the Russians that really in the long run we want to invest in you, we want to build hotels, so to speak. And then you can stop acting crazy, as he said the other day, about Putin. It won't work, but that's what the Americans will try to do.
We'll see how much that bears fruit. Thank you, Rasmus. That was fascinating. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.